Hello, I'm Ellis, and this is the seventh of a series of talk through videos associated with the book Absolutization, which is the first in my middle way philosophy series. So far we've been working through 23 different features of absolutization. That's in the first 5 sections of the book. And then in the 6th section, which was the previous video to this one, I talked about the relationships between those different features and the overall context in which we should interpret that relationship. So the unity of absolutizing features as to how far we should regard them as the same thing. So what I've been trying to do, as I explained in that section, is to bring together different disciplinary perspectives on absolutization. The term absolutization is not commonly used, but it's a sort of transdisciplinary term to use to get beyond just seeing it philosophically, or just seeing it systemically, or just seeing it philosophically. What I'm now trying to do in the remainder of these videos and the remaining section of the book is to lay out 4 criteria for the middle way, as I call them. So there are 4 criteria for the effective response to absolutization. So these are the parameters which I think are required really for any effective response to it. Parameters which are really created by the nature of absolutization itself. So that's why these 4 criteria follow on from the account of the different features of absolutization, and they're part of the practical goals of the whole project. Yeah. So I'm trying to help people address absolutization. Hence, I don't want to just leave people with, there's all these bad things happening in the book. I want to finish the book with some ways forward, with at least a sketch of what it means to respond to absolutization. So the first of those general ways of responding is practicality. So my argument is that any effective response to absolutization must be practical. Obviously, a lot here lies on what we mean by practical. Understanding practicality. Understanding practicality in a sufficiently wide sense, not a narrow sense. But nevertheless, having a practical focus rather than just a theoretical process. And that means questioning a lot of what we often assume to be the boundaries between theory and practice. That quite often the way people view theory is kind of in the terms of abstraction as an end in itself, whether they're engaging in it or whether they're rejecting it. And quite often the way they view practice is limited to certain conditions where you've got certain clear goals within a certain set of conditions. So you're trying to fix your car or something, so you know what you're trying to do there. You're trying to get the car to work in order to be able to drive it somewhere. That's easily circumscribed. You're using certain models of what you're doing. It's not engaging with the wider complexity of, well, should you have a car in the first place, and what's the effect of it, and where do these parts come from, and everything else that might be involved in the judgments you're applying when you try and fix your car. So there's always a wider context when we ask what is practical. Nevertheless, when we are impractical, what we end up doing is absolutizing, really. So we take abstract beliefs and even if we're apparently engaged in the practical activity, we can do it impractically, in the sense that we do it in the terms of those abstract beliefs, and we're confined by those beliefs, and we allow those to let us think we have the whole story, and thus block out other ways of approaching our practical task. So practicality, in the wider sense I'm using the term, needs to be an open practicality, a practicality that tries to address a range of conditions, not just the specific condition that's in front of you. And so I think that practicality is actually a criteria one can use to judge the helpfulness of any theory, philosophy, approach, religion, whatever it is, any theoretical construction that may be used in relation to the issues of absolutization. If it's not practical, it's not going to help you. So I argue that there are three features of practicality which will help us be clearer about what we're talking about. And those are embodiment, responsibility, and effectiveness. So embodiment is really coming to terms with what it is to have a body, with the limitations that go with having a body, and the basis of meaning that goes with having a body. So embodied meaning is part of the wider understanding of embodiment. So it actually introduces intellectual elements, not merely abstract elements, but intellectual elements that we need to understand what embodied meaning is. So embodiment broadly is being adapted to a human body and its limitations. Basically, if we're whatever kind of judgment or practice we are engaged in our lives, we'll engage with that more effectively, and we'll be less likely to get caught up in absolutization if we understand that in an embodied way, which begins with a recognition of our limitations. So we have a specific perspective, specific biases that go with that perspective, which come from our body. Our body has, can be explained further in all sorts of ways. You can say, well, it has genetic origins. It's been affected by the culture in which we live. It's been affected by our nutrition or our diet or our health or whatever. All sorts of conditions at work. But nevertheless, there we are with our body, whatever the prior conditions that gave rise to that body and its limitations. And human bodies have certain things in common that you can reasonably generalize about. And that includes the basic shape of the human body, the structure of the brain, the limbs, the nervous system. So there are things that humans can do that blackbirds can't do, and so on. So all of that goes with the territory of embodiment. And one of the key implications of embodiment, if we take embodiment seriously, is that absolute beliefs involve not recognizing embodiment. They involve an assumption of a God's eye view, the assumption that we can in some sense look down and represent the world from beyond the embodied perspective. And that's an incredibly pervasive assumption that people slip into all the time in different theoretical, academic, religious, whatever contexts. We even, commonly take absolute or metaphysical beliefs as a starting point for how we need to live our lives. Hence the idea that religion should be based on absolute beliefs, which I argue doesn't need to follow at all in religion. But on the contrary, I would say adopting that disembodied standpoint in our understanding of where we are and what we need to do interferes with constantly interferes with our the effectiveness with which we address the conditions around us. And although it may seem that some people address conditions better because of their absolute beliefs, I would change the phrasing of that to say it's in spite of their absolute beliefs. So the example of saints is quite interesting. So one saint I greatly admire, for example, is Saint Francis of Assisi. He's a man who definitely believed in that. He held absolute beliefs. He was a medieval Catholic, and he had at least formal obeisance to the Pope, who was this absolute authority in the church at the time. But he was a very practical man. He obviously had a lot of compassion for the people around him, and he was able to respond to them in a way that really inspired them. And his personal spirituality was obviously very effective. He was able to engage in spiritual practice. So saints of that kind are practical despite their absolute beliefs. And I would suggest that that's probably because they don't actually apply those absolute beliefs in many cases to the practical judgments they're making. So the constraints of absolute beliefs depend very much on how you apply them and how much you're aware of an embodied perspective as an alternative to that absolute standpoint. Whereas, in contrast to the saint, there's the bigot. So this is just a convenient label, really. So the bigot is somebody who does actually apply absolute beliefs, and those absolute beliefs clearly interfere all the time with practicality. So, for example, they end up in creating racist riots, for example. So that's a pretty classic bigot thing to do, because you have these narrow views about other people of different races, and you resent them being in your space, and so you create an ideology, and you get lots of other people to support you, and you enter into power relationships, and so on. So you rely on absolute beliefs which exclude awareness, and you do that with disastrous practical effects that produce lots of repression and conflict. So the presence of saints and bigots, it doesn't mean that everybody who holds absolute beliefs is a bigot, at least to the same extent. But nevertheless, the absolute beliefs continue to have a negative effect on people's judgments when they are applied. And that's because they distract from or interfere with our awareness of our embodied situation and its limitations. There's also the interpretation of the state of embodiment itself. So often recognizing embodiment is wrongly associated with deterministic sort of physicalist views, which it is a scientific attempt to absolutely describe our bodies and the way they function and the way they make us operate. Make us being important there. That's another dogma. That's another completely abstracted dogma, because it relies on this view that we can have a complete understanding of the causality of the universe, and this then applies absolutely to us, which is incredibly arrogant, I think, determinism, but it's taken for granted in many scientific applications. So embodiment, I think, as the basis of practicality needs us to be agnostic about free will and determinism, to leave aside any application of a belief that we are absolutely free or absolutely determined. Instead, we're influenced by conditions, and we also experience choice. We don't have to answer the question about how much choice we actually have. We just have to work with our experience. And that's central to embodiment and embodied practice. So embodiment takes us into incrementality, and stretch. So the idea of stretch ethics, which will be the title of one of my books later on in the series. Incrementality, which is one of the principles of middle way philosophy. That is, we try and think of things as a matter of degree rather than in discontinuous absolute ways. Okay, so we need to be embodied to be practical. Second feature of practicality is responsibility. So likewise, we need to be responsible to be practical. That is, we need to be motivated, and we need to feel motivated, not just have a supposed motivation imposed on us. And in order to make judgments that are perhaps slightly more open than the ones we made before, which take more conditions into account, that address new things, that are adaptable. So responsibility, I'm applying in a felt sense here, yes. So we have to feel responsible in order to be responsible. I'm not talking here about the mechanisms of being held responsible, which are social or legal mechanisms. That's not to say I don't think those mechanisms are important. I do think they're important, but they're not the model we should use to understand responsibility in our experience. Socially imposed responsibility is when you hold the criminal responsible for their crime, for example. You hold a politician responsible for their failure to address a certain problem in society, whatever it is. Yeah, and that's all socially and politically and legally necessary for the running of society. But importantly, law is not ethics. Social regulation is not ethics. Ethics is more than that. Ethics requires us to stretch ourselves in practice, in embodied practice. So taking responsibility involves feeling it, involves cultivating an awareness of it, and we can apply that sense of responsibility in various ways. So obviously we can be responsible in a normal social sense. We can be responsible for things people expect us to be responsible for, like our children, for example. But there's also things that are much more dubious and borderline when it comes to responsibility for many people. So being responsible for our mental states is a great one. So if you're feeling angry, if you say things to somebody like, "You made me angry, look what you've done to me," then you're not taking responsibility for your mental states. But taking responsibility for your mental states means that you can recognise how your own practice influences your mental states as you go on, how it creates the conditions in which your mental states arise. Responsibility for the meaning of terms is also important, so that we don't just take the meaning of the terms we use, like practicality, for example, or the middle way, or any of the terms I'm using, that we don't just take those as givens, because the way that terms are understood has an effect, which may be a helpful one or maybe an unhelpful one, but the key thing is to think about, to be aware of those impacts as far as we can. That if you are constrained by a particular context into thinking in a certain way about the meaning of a term, say what it means to be a Christian, then that's not going to help you to stretch your practice in relation to the world in which that term is used. It's not going to help you, for example, to be a better Christian in a deeper moral sense if you have too fixed an idea of what it means to be a Christian. That's related also to responsibility for interpretation. So that's interpretation of terms, but also interpretation of what other people say. So causing offence is a great example of that. Yeah. So if you believe that you were offended and it's all the other guy's fault, then you're not taking responsibility for your interpretation of that other person's what that other person said. Now, obviously, in social terms, yes, they have responsibility for what they said, but that takes you immediately onto the social, legal, possibly political level. In terms of your operation and the effect it has on you, you need to take responsibility also for how you respond and how you interpret what everyone else says. So you can easily construct a world in which people are constantly offending you and neglect to recognise the role that you have in being offended. Responsibility also for factual assumptions. So again, I mean, making good use of science and scientific evidence is probably part of that, because very often, or usually, I think, scientists are pretty responsible in the way they use evidence. There are exceptions to that, but it's generally more responsible to at least take account of scientific evidence, to try and take it seriously, to try and understand it, than it is to ignore it or discount it unreflectively. And the factual assumptions we adopt are obviously crucial to all sorts of decisions that we make. And responsibility for our values is also very important. So again, that we don't think of values as something separate from facts, as something just subjective. Whatever subjective is supposed to mean, which is virtually nothing actually. But the values we apply are the ones we have cultivated, the ones we've the effect of our practice. And obviously we have certain starting points. There are values that we may get from our parents and from our profession or whatever conditions we've been working in. But what do we then do with those? If we take responsibility for those, then we'll start steering them in a helpful direction. So responsibility is not something that comes from God, from beyond, from some absolute source from on high. They're what you do. They're about your embodied practical situation. And that's also the role of archetypal prompts responsibility, I think. So if a particular the recollection of a particular figure, say Jesus or the Buddha, helps you to be responsible, then great. Recollect that figure. You don't have to have absolute beliefs about that figure in order to be responsible. In fact, quite the opposite. Okay, and then the third element of practicality, apart from being embodied and being responsible, is effectiveness. So again, this can often be missed, that in order to be practical, one could, this is entirely compatible with being effective, but you need to understand effectiveness in a way that is not too narrowly focused. So you can have a kind of short-term limited effectiveness under the impact of absolutization. It can apparently make you more successful at doing something in a very restricted set of conditions, but the difficulty is you're not looking beyond those conditions, and conditions tend to change, so your narrow focus is likely to be challenged increasingly by new conditions. So I've broken down the idea of effectiveness here, basically how well we fulfill our provisional goals, into three elements. So there's there's the intensity and the directionality and the sustainability of our actions. So our actions can be more effective when they're more intense. Now, for that, think particularly of a kind of a task requiring strength, like using a pickaxe or something like that. Yeah, you're trying to make a hole with a pickaxe, so you need to apply enough force with that pickaxe to make the hole or break up the rock or whatever it is you're trying to do with the pickaxe. So intensity is required there. And maybe having an absolute belief about what you're doing can help you in the short term to have an effective blow with that pickaxe. You're fired up with the zeal of your evangelical beliefs, for example, and you're gonna swing that pickaxe and break up the devil of the rock or whatever it is. But basically, the energy that we apply to any task is actually reduced in the wider analysis if there's any conflict applied to it. So the moment you start doubting the correctness of the view that you're applying when you apply that energy with your pickaxe, the less effective your application is going to be. So if you're in a conflicted state of mind, even with a simple task like that, it can interfere, perhaps less obviously. But the more complex the task, then the more obvious this may become. So yeah, obviously the way that can operate can be quite subtle. So repression, abstract in psychology, can operate in ways that we don't expect, and that's because we've repressed it, so we're not recognizing it, and then it comes out in some sense, interferes with our activity or our goals, in some way sabotages us. So if you think about the phenomena of self-sabotage, perhaps that will help here, that we can set out to do a particular task and then we get distracted. Perhaps we procrastinate, or perhaps we simply can't stay focused. And that's the reason for that is we're conflicting. We've got other things going on that keep recurring, that keep coming up. We keep thinking about what we should have said to that person rather than what we're trying to do. And now that takes us into directionality, which is another of the aspects of effectiveness. So that the more complex our task, the more obvious it becomes that the direction, the directing of our effort needs to be very well targeted. So if you're doing something even relatively complex like fixing an engine or something, you have to take different things into account. You need to take care. So you need to direct your efforts in a particular way, an intelligent way. But the more prone you are to distraction and conflict, the less likely you are to be able to do that. And that becomes even more obvious when you've got something like when there's a particularly conventionally dominant way of doing something and you need to think differently in order to direct your efforts effectively in a particular area. So agriculture seems to be a good example of that. So there's well-entrenched ways of doing agriculture which are destroying the earth, frankly. And we need to do it differently. But there's such a strong impetus, such strong habits which are guiding us constantly doing it in the ways that we're used to doing it. And those habitual ways of doing it, customary ways of doing agriculture, simply don't take into account complexity. And complexity in this case involves complex ecosystems and the wider environment in which you are doing the agriculture, and the ways that your agricultural activity in the longer term depend on, for example, biodiversity, depend on the climate, even depend on your mental state as the farmer. So there's there can be problems with directionality. The more you neglect complexity is avoided. You remain unaware of complexity as long as you're stuck in an absolutized view of a particular thing. And that's also related to sustainability. So it's harder to keep going with something that requires effort over time, and that involves changed conditions, particularly if you are in conflict and if you have absolutized beliefs. So that effect is likely to be greater the longer you go on, the wider the range of conditions that you're dealing with over time. So increased duration increases the chances that absolutization will interfere with your activity and the effectiveness of your activity. Now, there's another positive side to that, you could say, in that sustained practice of something actually helps you as well. And the reason it does that is because obviously you become more skilled at it by practicing it, and you also become more confident in it. So that laying down of neural pathways that goes with performing a task in a certain way makes it easier for you to do that task subsequently, and means you're less likely to encounter barriers or difficulties in the future when you do it. I mean, an obvious example is learning to ride a bicycle. Once you become confident with riding a bicycle, you don't think about it anymore. You just get on your bicycle and cycle, but you forget how difficult it was when you were 4 years old and trying to learn how to ride a bicycle and wobbling around. And that's the same applies to anything. So confidence helps. And confidence can actually help us to take into account more conditions, as long as we pay attention to feedback from either from the environment or from others, and as long as we remain provisional and keep correcting what we're doing in response. So all that can aid sustainability. But at the same time, we need to balance that confidence that we've developed against the danger of absolutization. That obviously confidence, there's a certain point where confidence can tip into overconfidence when it's accompanied by absolutizing views about the thing we're confident about. So there's a subtle balance involved in practice between remaining confident in what we're doing and remaining open to correction. And when that balance is achieved, our confidence actually helps us to change our practice and to develop and sustain our practice in different conditions. But when we tip into overconfidence, that confidence then actually interferes with our ability to adapt. It becomes, and it reinforces the absolutization. Okay, so practicality is likely to include confidence, but with certain limitations. Okay, so that's an overall view of practicality. So just to remind you of my overall thesis in relation to practicality: any effective response to absolutization needs to be practical, and that means it needs to be embodied, responsible, and effective. And it's very common for theoretical approaches not to be sufficiently practically focused. So they're not starting with embodiment as their basic condition, and with embodied meaning as part of that. So there are approaches that can claim to be practical, but they're quite narrowly focused, or they can claim to be practical, they're maybe just focused on a particular professional practice, say, and not on a wider personal practice. And there can be approaches that are basically theoretical. They've adopted, uncritically adopted, some theoretical perspective from tradition, and then they claim it's practical, but it's very superficial. So practicality requires scrutiny. Is this approach really going to help? Is it really taking embodiment to account in a deep way? Particularly in terms of the assumptions it makes about meaning. So that's where we get into issues with metaphysics and so on. Yeah, they don't take into account embodied meaning. And is it really supporting our responsibility, or is it taking a shortcut, free will determinism sort of shortcut? Is it really aiding our effectiveness, or is it supporting overconfidence, for example? Okay, so that's the first of the 4 criteria for the middle way, and I'm going to leave it there, and there will be separate videos on each of the other 3.